there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's just after 5 p.m. on an August afternoon in 2015, and a 911 call is coming through about a fire at a service station in Columbus, Ohio.
Okay, stop screaming because I can't understand you. I got you.
The man is still there too, according to the caller. He poured 2 jerry cans of fuel over the woman's head and body, and now he's just watching the flames engulf her.
It's on the way.
Can you tell me who did this? Like,
there's a guy out there who's standing out there still. He's in a boiler black truck. He has tattoos all over him. He's still here.
The woman is 31-year-old Judy Malinowski. The man is her partner, Michael Slager. Eventually, he tries to put her out with a fire extinguisher. As she's rushed to hospital, her family is warned that she likely won't survive more than a few hours, days at most. Her injuries are catastrophic. But Judy survives years, in a coma for some of it, and in pain for all of it. But she lives long enough to do something never before seen in American history. Judy Malinowski is the first person to testify at her own murder trial. I'm Gemma, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. 5 months before her death, Judy gave harrowing testimony to be used should she pass away. In it, she described the moments before she was set on fire.
After he poured the gasoline on you, what happens next?
He backed away from me for about 30 seconds, and I kept telling him, so please help me and stop, and I'll get the truck, I'll go with you. You know, why would you do this? And I looked at him, and he pulled a lighter out of his pocket, and he started walking towards me, and I just remember crying and begging for help. And he let me on fire, and the look in his eyes went back, literally.
She described the pain.
My whole body felt like it was like 1,000 needles going in, 1,000 hot needles penetrating my body. I can't tell you or describe how it feels. It's just waking up is a horrible thing. They say it gets a little better as time goes by, but it's one thing heals, another thing hurts.
Then she told the judge exactly what she thought her killer deserved.
I want you to tell a future judge what you want to see happen to Mr. Slager.
I would like to see him charged with murder and do a life sentence. I think that he deserves that.
Judy lived for nearly 2 years after being set on fire. She endured more than 60 surgeries, including excruciating skin grafts, and suffered 7 cardiac arrests. She died on June 27, 2017, with her family by her bedside. She was only 33. Judy's story has been told in detail in the documentary The Fire That Took Her, directed by Patricia Gillespie. Patricia joins us now. Patricia, how did you become involved in this story and with Judy and her family?
Yeah, so I started looking at this story many years ago. Trump had just won the election in the US, and a lot of the energy that went into that was in the Midwest. And I was very interested. I felt like there weren't a lot of stories coming out of the Midwest of the United States, the heartland, as it were. And so I started reading local papers there just to try to understand that part of the country a little better. I live in New York City, and I stumbled across Judy's story quite by accident. And I was so moved by it because I felt like it was the story not just of a victim, but a victim who took it upon herself to become the hero of her own story. And that was really engaging to me. So I got on Facebook and stalked her mom and drove out to Ohio. And over the course of a number of meetings, we decided to make the movie together, me and her family.
Can you give us an overview of Judy's life prior to meeting Michael? She was a mum, she'd recently beaten cancer. She'd lived quite a big life before all of this happened.
Yeah, so I think there are many elements of Judy's story that are sort of all American, right? She's born in this Ohio suburb. She wins a beauty contest in her town. I think she was the homecoming queen. She fell in love in her early 20s, got married, had a couple kids. That marriage, unfortunately, didn't work out. And around the time the marriage was ending, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And I believe she was pregnant already with her second daughter, Maddie. And she wanted to continue that pregnancy, so she couldn't take some of the therapies that were needed for the cancers. So she got on some level of pain management, or maybe she was wanting to try for Maddie. I can't quite remember. But anyway, she couldn't have the full chemohysterectomy at the moment she was diagnosed. And so they started to give her pain medication. And this was before the US really had a comprehensive understanding of the opioid crisis and the role the pharmaceuticals play in that. And she got addicted to the medication, taking it exactly as the doctor prescribed. But once that prescription ran out, she was very dependent on it. That sort of transmogrified into a drug addiction, which eventually led to her using heroin. She was a really dedicated mom, even when she was using, her girls were a priority in her life, and she got herself clean. She had a good amount of time together sober by the time she met Michael. And then once her and Michael got together, that sort of went out the window pretty quickly.
How did Michael come onto the scene? How did they meet, and how did that relationship become what it was?
So they actually knew each other through her ex-husband. He had been part of her husband's friend group, I guess. Judy's mom, Bonnie, might say that she became interested in Michael perhaps to make her ex-husband jealous initially, but it does seem like for a time they had a genuine relationship that maybe moved a little bit too quickly, and those red flags might have been missed. So Michael himself was not an addict, but Michael had a history of dating women who were addicts and a number of women who were sober after having been addicted to opiates. And then for whatever reason, these women all ended up using again over the course of the relationship with him. And I think the feeling Judy's family has is that the drugs were reintroduced as a form of control, which is a kind of pathway to domestic abuse or domestic abuse in itself that on the ground level I see is very common, but isn't necessarily something we talk about. But if you become the person supplying your girlfriend with drugs, you have a fair amount of power in that relationship. So that became the arrangement, I think, fairly quickly after they got together. And then he started abusing her, but she was dependent on him for those drugs. So it was a really difficult situation to try to get out of. But she did, within a couple months, enough was enough. And she was trying to leave that relationship. She called the police numerous times and once even told them she thought he was going to kill her. But unfortunately, like in the States, unless the police are on the ground and see something going wrong actively or have some sort of forensic proof, there's not much that they can do.
What about Michael? He has quite a lengthy criminal history, doesn't he?
So Michael had, I forget the exact number, but he had many, many, many prior charges related to domestic abuse, or I believe there's some charges related to sexual assault in there. And really what that comes down to is that we just don't punish guys enough for that kind of thing. He would sort of come back to court, get a slap on the wrist and leave. He served minor amounts of time, I think mostly in county jail, but never really got a substantial sentence. And it's horrifying when you do read his record. You sort of see somebody amping up to progressively more violent crimes. And it took him lighting a woman on fire to actually get any substantial prison time at all, really.
What was the state of Michael and Judy's relationship by the time we get to August 2015 when the fire happened?
I think Judy was in the process of splitting up from him. She knew she needed out of that relationship, but she was also wanting to go back to rehab to get clean again because she understood that was part of leaving Michael. She had to be sober to get away from him because he was so involved in her drug life and the way that she, in the quote unquote safest way possible, got drugs. So she needed to get sober to cut it off with him. And he was actually driving her to rehab that day when this incident happened.
Can you walk us through what happened? Because the two of them were having a bit of an argument behind kind of a gas station, weren't they?
Yeah. I mean, they argued a lot throughout their relationship over everything, including some quite insubstantial things. My understanding is they had stopped to get cigarettes at the gas station, and Judy was talking about that she wanted to do a few more things before she went to rehab, that she wanted to go see her kids. And she had spoken to her mother, and her mother was wondering if she would come by the house to see her daughters before she went. And they got into an argument. I guess Judy sort of had enough and threw a soda at him. And his response was to douse her in gasoline and 30, 40 seconds later, come back and light her on fire. Michael's version of the story is that he was just dousing her in gasoline to quote unquote get her back for throwing the soda on him. Obviously, that's pretty improbable. It's not really a normal response. And he says that she went up in flame because less than a minute later, he wanted to be a gentleman and light her cigarette for her. That was his story. And Judy's story was that he doused her in gasoline, went back to the truck and came up with, I think she said he looked like the devil. His eyes sort of just went black and he lit her on fire and she blacked out.
Well, there were several witnesses, weren't they, who watched it all happen and then watched him kind of stand there and just watch.
Yeah, there were indeed. There were a number of people, a veteran, a fellow who was in the Marines who actually took the keys away from Michael and stopped him from leaving, and a couple. And according to one of the members of this couple, he actually was just sort of staring at Judy burning until he realized people were looking, at which point he does go and get a fire extinguisher. But quite a bit of time elapses before he gets that fire extinguisher. I would like to think if it were me in that situation, I'd be running for the fire extinguisher right away. That isn't what happened. These witnesses feel he started to really just make moves once he realized he was being observed.
Judy obviously was taken to hospital. Michael was as well. Can you talk us through the extent of the injuries that Judy suffered?
Yeah, she was burned over 90% of her body. She lost her fingers, a number of her fingers, her ears. She was just covered in open wounds from these burns that never healed. She survived 700 days after this incident, and she never healed completely. And the amount of swelling that you experience when you're burned like that, the earliest photos of her after the incident, many of which we didn't include in the film because if you can believe it, they're more graphic than what we did show. I'll use her sister's words. She hardly looked like a person. She was very, very badly injured. Michael also sustained some burns, putting her out, which he really liked to talk about. In my line of work, I see a lot of images of injured people or maimed people, and this was by far the worst stuff I'd ever seen. And in fact, the Marine who was one of the witnesses at the crime scene who had been to war and seen people really seriously injured said it was the worst thing he'd seen as well.
Well, her daughters didn't even recognise her, and I recall that her sister vomited from the site.
Look, there are some things that just aren't supposed to happen to a human body, and I feel like that's one of them. I mean, it's very hard to fathom, and then to see somebody alive after that. I remember seeing those photos and being like, I don't understand how she didn't die. The doctors didn't understand how she didn't die. The EMTs didn't understand how she didn't die. It was just such a severe thing that happened to her.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with director Patricia Gillespie about the case of Judy Malinowski, who was burnt alive by her boyfriend. You got to know Judy's mum and you interviewed her about her version of seeing her daughter like that. What were her recollections of that day, about getting that call and about arriving at the hospital?
You know, I think for Bonnie, it was really kind of a blur. She gets this call. She's asked first, hey, can we intubate your daughter? Like, can we put her on a ventilator? And she says, well, yeah, of course. And then it takes a couple seconds to click. Oh my gosh, that's life support. Like something very serious has happened to her. This isn't just an accident or a burn. This is, you know, my kid's on life support. And she describes the experience of going to the hospital, which is OSU is a hospital. She lives nearby and drives by all the time, and she got lost. She was just so dissociated. She rushes into the hospital and they finally let her back to see Judy. And this reaction that everybody else has of sort of shock and horror isn't the reaction that Bonnie has. She just sees her kid. She just sees her baby, and she's so happy she's alive. And she turns to the doctor and says, tell me there's hope, tell me there's hope, tell me there's hope. And at that point, the percent of Judy's body that was burned, she was almost guaranteed to die. And that's not what happened, thanks to the amazing work of the doctors at OSU. And I believe Judy's desire to live and see her girls grow up as long as she could and try to get some justice for herself, that kept her alive for that 700 days.
Well, even in that really early period after the fire, she was able to give a very brief but a bedside interview to cops, wasn't she?
Yeah, so she was very burnt. And when someone is that burnt, usually you put them under pretty quickly just because the pain is extremely severe and there's a risk of going in shock. So they had put her under a bunch of pain medication, but realizing that it was very likely she would pass away, the police and the doctors decided together to back her off that a little bit so she could become more aware of what was going on around her. And the detective on the case, who's now a lieutenant, Chad Cohagen, came in and asked her if Michael had done this to her, and she nodded her head yes.
And they also had a chat with Michael, which is, you can watch that. There's footage of it. And it's quite eerie. He's very calm and tells that version of events you explained earlier.
Yeah, Michael thought this was all very explainable. He was a pretty cool customer. So we got body cam from the police in Ohio. It's most American police officers now wear a body camera, and that stuff becomes part of the public record eventually in the case of a crime. And we were able to get that from the Gahanna police, the investigating agency. And yeah, you see Michael. The thing that really shocked me about that is he seemed to feel bad for himself because of the burns he had sustained trying to save her. And that seemed to be his main concern. And he tried to explain how this was an accident. He tried to displace blame on Judy a little bit, I think, for what had happened. And Detective Cohagen, I have to say, he did a really incredible job. He walked a very fine line between hearing him out and not letting him wriggle away. Just did some very good work there, got a cheek swab from him and all that, which I can't imagine being able to keep your cool like that in that kind of circumstance, having just seen Judy.
Even though there were witnesses, there was also CCTV footage, so you can actually watch it all unfold.
Yeah. You see Detective Cohagen tell Michael that in the hospital, and I'm not sure that was something Michael realized because the CCTV was actually from a bank next door. The drive-through ATM had a camera on it that could see into the parking lot where this happened. So if you were to go into the parking lot of the gas station where this happened and look around, you wouldn't see a physical camera, but it was one parking lot over very close by. You can see the whole thing. And to that point, it doesn't really appear that Michael and Judy made up to any extent that he would be a gentleman and light her cigarette after dousing her in gasoline on that video. So,
as morbid as it sounds, police were kind of waiting. They were waiting to see whether Judy would die, to kind of see what they would be charging Michael with, whether it would be murder or something lesser. But Judy defied the odds and she woke up after 7 months in a coma. In terms of her medical treatment, what did she endure? Because it's not like she woke up and was okay. She had multiple surgeries.
Yeah, she was constantly having surgeries and skin grafts. When you're burnt as badly as Judy was, wound maintenance is also really important, because one of the major things you can die of with burns like that is infection, because your skin is what protects you from the outside world, and she didn't really have it. So she would regularly have to get these wounds cleaned and debrided, kind of scraping out these wounds. And no amount of pain medication made that feel okay. You just can't give someone that amount of pain medication. And you also have to consider Judy she was on her way to rehab. She was addicted to opioids. So the doses that might work on you or I, they were not as strong as they would be for a person without a history of opioid abuse as well. So yeah, it was a very tough time for her, for sure. Because they expected her to die, the detectives were sort of waiting to see, had Judy died, Michael would have been charged with murder. But because she survived, they were unable to do that. So they charged him with aggravated arson, which unfortunately in the state of Ohio, lighting your girlfriend on fire carries a very similar penalty to lighting a car on fire, lighting a house on fire. So the maximum he could get in that instance was about 11 years.
And the other thing to add to that was that there was a real possibility that she was going to be able to give testimony if it went to trial. But he changed his plea to no contest. So he effectively silenced her.
Yeah. So they're approaching this trial, and Judy is not only able to testify, she really wants to testify, because she is, even though this is on video, her testimony really is, that sinks it. When your victim lives and can say that she knows you did this with malice and can provide an alternative story of what we all see on that tape, that was pretty much going to ensure a conviction. And I think Michael realized this, that between the fact that there was a tape at all and that Judy, who had to be just about the most sympathetic person you could put on the stand, was going to explain what we were watching on that tape, Michael realized that he was definitely going to be convicted, and he took a plea deal. But he pled in this way. He took something called an Alford plea. I'm not sure if you have this in Australia, but in the US, you can plead guilty by essentially saying, well, I'm not saying I'm guilty, but I'm choosing to plead guilty because I think you have the evidence to convict me, and I would rather get this lesser sentence. So that's where the 11 years came from.
So he's not admitting fault. That's a real slap in the face by doing that plea.
Yeah. The Alford plea is very complicated because it's like the justice system here, like anywhere, is not perfect. And I've heard stories of innocent people who pled guilty because the optics of who they were and the crime they were charged with and where they were being tried, they were like, I would rather take a deal for 7 years than a deal for 20 years, right? And so in some ways, I think it's good that exists so people can say their piece, right? And part of the reason you can do that is because it's covered by free speech, right? You can say whatever you want and take your plea. But on the other hand, I think in cases where the person is guilty, it's really painful for the victim's family. And I know it was painful for Judy because she just really wanted him to take accountability.
Well, he did get 11 years initially. And the judge, she was very damning. Can you tell us about the sentence or her sentencing remarks?
Yeah, the judge was ticked off. She told Michael that she wished she could sentence him to more and that she couldn't because of the laws. And, it's interesting. Bonnie and I talked about this a lot where we were like, okay, well, in what way should this law be expanded? Should you create a law to expand sentences for people like this? And how should you make sure people who commit this sort of crime get sentenced appropriately? And it's tough because I think in the States, we like to think of these crimes of like immolation or acid attacks. They think of these things as something that happens somewhere else, when in reality, that's not true. There are many, many instances every year of intimate partners who intentionally disfigure their victims, and also strangers, right? It's a worldwide phenomenon now. We've had incel murders where people are being killed or disfigured by a disgruntled, involuntary celibate person who sort of just goes off the rails and goes postal. And there's not really any specific law for that type of crime. And I think early in the process when Bonnie was thinking through it, she was like, well, why isn't that sort of a hate crime, right? If you're like, you're a woman, you won't be with me, I'm going to essentially try to make you quote unquote ugly, or I'm going to, it's not just I'm going to kill you, it's I'm going to disfigure you. Why isn't that classed as a specific kind of crime? Because statistically, you just don't see it happen to men nearly as much as women. But that was a little bit complicated. So once that decision came down and he got such a light sentence for something that had really changed Judy's entire life, her family started to pursue changing that law by adding time to the sentences of attackers who intentionally disfigure their victims. So right after that court case went the way it did, Judy decided to launch a campaign alongside a number of state senators in Ohio to pass something called Judy's Law, which adds 6 years to the sentences of attackers who intentionally disfigure their victims using an accelerant. So it's pretty narrow, but it did lay the groundwork and set a precedent for a federal law, something that's nationwide as opposed to in the state of Ohio, and also a pathway to say, well, there are elements of an assault or an aggravated arson that push it past the base charges, right? This is different than punching someone in the face and breaking their nose, and the sentencing should reflect that.
And we're skipping forward a bit, but they were successful in passing that.
Yeah, so Judy's Law was signed into law, unfortunately, just a few days after she passed away. But it had passed in the House and Senate when she was still alive, and she got to understand that that law was moving forward. And I think that was one of the things she was most proud of next to her girls.
I think it's worth acknowledging just how strong Judy was as a person. She was enduring daily unimaginable pain, and she's fighting for this law, as well as, which we're about to talk about, she ends up giving testimony for her future murder trial, which is another incredible history-making change. How did that come about?
So it started to look like Judy's condition was not going to improve. A lot of time had gone by, and it looked likely that though Judy wasn't dying imminently, after about a year, they saw that the skin grafts weren't taking, and it was going to be a matter of time until she passed away. She would pass away prematurely from these injuries. And knowing that, the DA said that when she died, they would take Michael up on murder charges. It becomes a new crime. She passed away. It's no longer just an assault. It's murder. They're going to charge him with that. And they were going to petition the state of Ohio to allow her to pre-record sworn testimony in advance of her death, which had never happened in a criminal court before. Warren Edwards, who's now a judge, but at the time was the ADA, he adapted a civil statute that was actually designed for mesothelioma victims. It's a substance that people inhaled that ended up giving them lung cancer. And there were a number of civil lawsuits, people suing the companies that gave them these mesothelioma-related health conditions posthumously. So they would record a deposition in advance of their death, and then once they died, this would be played at the civil trial where their family was suing, right? And there's a law in the United States that says if there is no specification whether you can or cannot do something in a criminal court of law, you can adapt civil law. And so Warren saw that, and he adapted this civil statute and presented this argument to the judge saying, hey, if we can do this in civil court, we should do it in criminal court. And we don't want to take just a deathbed statement from her. We want it to be real testimony. We want her to be sworn in, put under oath, and both questioned by the DA and cross-examined formally. And so they won the right to do that, and that's what they did. But Judy had to back off her pain medication in order to be considered of sound mind, which you have to be to testify in the American courts. So she experienced just a tremendous amount of pain. She had to learn to talk over and off the vent. She was not speaking super clearly at the time this decision was made. So she had to push herself to really be able to be heard and to come off that ventilator. And and she also had to practice to be cross-examined, which any woman who's ever been in the American court system can tell you it's not a friendly place for victims, particularly victims of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, or offenses like that. There's a lot of victim blame that goes down. So, but she steeled herself and she did it, and she endured 3 hours of questioning. And most of that was the defense.
Watching some of that testimony, you can tell that she's in pain and she's struggling, but she does not waver. She gives incredible testimony. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think she was a shockingly reliable narrator for what happened to her. And most people, I think, when they go through something like that, they can't recall the kind of detail that she could, and she could. But unfortunately, the defense attorney kept trying to poke holes in her memory because she didn't remember what she was wearing that day, or she didn't remember where they had stopped before the speedway, or she didn't remember. And, there's this moment where she looks at him and she says, "You have to understand, I was doused in gasoline and set on fire like over 90% of my body. So I'm not going to remember every perfect detail." And I remember seeing that moment in her testimony. And I was like, hell yeah. Like, you tell him. She made him look awful, and it was, and she was mad, and it was a great moment. I think there's a lot of pressure on victims, especially female victims. Maybe this is unique to the US, but I think it's most places in the world. There's this pressure on them to be like kind of beaten down and soft and demure, and she just was not about it. So she let the defense attorney know she was not impressed with the questions he was asking. He also asked her, just even the question, what were you wearing? It's just like, excuse me. She really stood her ground. You have to also remember she's doing this not knowing that it will ever officially be admitted. So what the first ruling was that allowed them to record this testimony was just that. You're allowed to record it. And then at a later time, when Michael is charged, then the new court case begins, and they have to argue about it all over again. They have to say, will we admit this? Okay, we gave you the right to record it. Will we admit it? And so she recorded all this knowing she would never know whether it would be admitted into court. And when you think about coming off your pain meds, being interrogated about some of the weakest moments in your life, your drug use, a relationship you shouldn't have been in, what you did when, and who you might have interacted with in what ways, and just all that sort of victim blame and pressure and pain, and to not even know if it'll count. And she did it anyway. I think that's incredibly heroic and incredibly inspiring. And, I think when she showed up for that testimony, and they do try to poke a lot of holes in her life, right? They try to shatter the illusion of the perfect victim, which of course doesn't exist. And I think a lot of women are afraid to prosecute their abusers because they understand that will be part of the process. And I think that Judy showing up and doing that was not just for her, it was for them. And I think it shows that the justice system, if you get the right people in the room, can work even if you're not perfect. And that pressure of the perfect victim, or to be the perfect victim, that we can break that down slowly. And I think Judy did a lot of that for us.
She was also able to use it as an opportunity to call out the police, call out the authorities and the systems that she tried to use again and again and again that didn't work.
Yeah, I think she was really disappointed. It was one of those things where I went in there feeling, before I did my research, like the police had mishandled something. But the more I spoke to them, the more I realized, just like Michael's sentencing, it's not so much that the police didn't care or didn't try to do their job. It's that the laws limited them so severely. Like, Michael had been staying at her apartment for a period of time. He was not on the lease. But once he was there 30 days, she can't just put him out. He lives there, right? So, there's they kept bumping into all sorts of things like this. Or Michael also did something that a lot of abusers do. And Michael started calling the police on her falsely, so that when the police would show up and she'd say, hey, this guy's beating me, they would look at the record. If they were able to look at the record, they would look at the record and they would see, oh, well, he's called on her. So it's he said, she said, when it's really not. This is a tactic abusers use. And that training isn't there, and nor is the law to really do anything about it. Abusers escalate, right? And the law doesn't necessarily account for that. And you see that in Michael's record. You see these numerous domestic violence charges, and the sentence doesn't really escalate. There's no diversion program. There's nowhere for him to go or to send him on a legal basis to stop him, right? There's no legal way to stop him, even though you see these repetitive charges escalating. In the same way, when someone's calling the police not once, not twice, but 10, 15 times, saying my boyfriend's beating me, anyone who has half a brain in their head understands this is eventually going to escalate. But there is no legal way to say, well, now you've done it 10 times, so we think you really might kill her. So we're going to escalate this to a new form of policing, or we're going to surveil you more. We're going to take you out of the house or take him out of the house. You kind of just have to wait for it to happen. And that's our law. That's how the law works here. And I think we should question whether there are smarter ways to police this kind of violence.
Well, there's similar holes in our system, and we see the same stuff going through the courts, the same problems. And it's not easy to fix, that's the thing, because there's so many different elements that you kind of have to target. It's just so sad that we have to keep watching it happen again and again and again. After giving her testimony, Judy died 5 months later, so in June 2017. She was put into a hospice. There was basically nothing more that they could do, was there?
Yeah, I mean, she sort of stopped responding to treatment. These skin grafts weren't going to work, and you can't live a normal lifespan with open wounds. So I believe most likely what she passed away from, her autopsy says it was a direct result of the burns, but your organs kind of start to shut down. So, she fought for a very long time. And I think that testimony also, her condition declined very steeply after that testimony. And I think some of that was just the effort involved in giving that testimony. But also, I think she felt she had to keep it together to get through that, that was a Herculean effort. And afterwards, she felt she'd said her piece and she could let go. But she would have hung in there if she could have, in any condition, because she loved her kids. She really loved her kids, and they loved her. And I think that's why she was able to go as long as she did.
Well, 2 years, that is an incredible feat.
Yeah.
So Michael is charged with murder, as we expect, after she dies. But then, like you also alluded to, comes the next fight where the defence is trying to exclude her testimony from the court.
Yeah. So they had a number of hearings about whether or not that testimony should be admissible. This was precedent setting. It hadn't happened before. So you can challenge anything new in the court system quite a bit. But thankfully, the judge did rule that he was going to admit this testimony. And that was really bad for Michael.
Yep.
So, and this is a murder case in Ohio. He's facing the death penalty. His life is on the line. And the best case scenario, if he's convicted, is pretty much life in prison. And the worst case is they're going to give him the needle. So, but Michael was very insistent in the months leading up to this trial that he wanted to go to trial. He was going to prove he was innocent. I think his lawyers were skeptical. Bonnie, Judy's mom, it was very important to her that he be made to take accountability in whatever way that was. So when they started to talk about Michael potentially taking a plea deal, Bonnie was really clear that if he was going to plead, he would need to plead guilty. He could not plead no contest because she would not accept anything else. And so as they moved up to the court date, it was a little unclear whether or not they were going to go for a full trial or whether he was going to plead. And the morning of that first hearing, I was there and we really didn't know. We went into that courtroom and we didn't understand if we were going to be hearing some pretrial motions and then showing up the next day for jury selection, or if the whole thing was going to end right there. And thankfully, he did decide to plead, apparently because his attorneys brought his daughter to the jail the night before. And she was like, Dad, please plead guilty because at least you'll be alive. Even if you're in jail, at least you'll be alive. And I don't want you to die. And that is supposedly the turning point for him. After he pled, one of the conditions of his plea was that they would play Judy's testimony in court in order to cement the legal precedent she had set by testifying in advance of her death. That sort of finalized the thing. So now anyone in the States can use that ruling to testify if they find themselves in an analogous situation. So they played the testimony, which was a very powerful moment. She was sort of like alive as this ghost on screen, finally able to tell her story. She literally had to die before anyone could hear her version of the story in public. And then it comes time for the sentencing, and they had asked her in the testimony to give a victim's impact statement, which she has the right to do. She has the right to say what sentence she wants him to get. And she had said she did not want him to get the death penalty. I forget exactly how they said it. They were like, and if he is convicted of this crime, what would you like to see him get? And she said, I'd like to see him get life. I think he deserves that. And she had the power to say, kill him. And she didn't. And I really think that's says a lot about her character. She understood in that moment she could hold that man's life in her hands after everything he did to her, and she decided to show mercy.
I think a really interesting part of your documentary was the insider look we got at her kids struggling with everything that happened. They gave you incredible access where you kind of saw the girls who were still kind of teenagers or young women when you were speaking to them, struggling to come to terms with their mum's addiction, which they didn't know about because they were too young, and then also struggling to come to terms with the fact that Michael would be in prison but he'd still get to see his family, and they wouldn't. They don't get to see their mum. So why does he get to see his family? I thought that was such an incredibly powerful insight to be able to give the public.
You know, one of the things that I'm preoccupied by in almost all my work is this idea of like the shrapnel of violence, right? Like when somebody is killed or severely harmed or forced to endure any of the bad stuff, right? It's not just that victim that's hurt. It's like everyone who loves them, everyone in their orbit, people in their community, people in their work life. Like it's just, these things have a ripple effect. And I was struck when I met Bonnie by like how her and Judy and the girls had sort of, they were like this island of women, right? Like supporting each other, getting each other through. And I related to that because I was raised almost exclusively by my mom, who had a very close relationship with her mom. And we were the island of women, right? And I think when it comes to domestic violence, it is so felt, not just by that victim, but by the victim's mother and by the victim's children. And I was very preoccupied with the children because they're girls, they're young girls. This is happening at a time in their life where they're deciding, what is the future going to look like for them when they start dating? What will that look like? Will they be able to trust someone enough? Will they be able to trust a man enough after seeing what happened to their mom that they can have the healthy relationships they deserve? Or if they saw too much of the wrong thing, will they accidentally, unconsciously repeat unhealthy patterns? And how do they reckon with this? Well, they're just trying to figure out how to be women. And they're seeing their mom undergo a lot of these things that, let's just be real, they're gender-based crimes. Like I'm not saying that domestic violence doesn't happen to men. It certainly does. I'm not saying it's an exclusively female problem, but there is a lot of sexism surrounding whether she was listened to when she was first reporting it, whether she was believed in court, how people looked at her addiction, how people listened to Michael when he would counter her story, right? I was just very preoccupied with how that would shape those girls. And thankfully, they're very strong like their mother, and they're all doing great. They have very normal young adult lives, and they're thriving. KK is in pre-law at a university not far from where her grandmother lives. And Maddie is finishing up high school, and she's on the cheerleading team and doing well in school and has a really sweet, nice boyfriend. And it's just great to see.
Thanks to Patricia Gillespie for assisting us to tell this story. You can find the guest's film, The Fire That Took Her, in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma and Tahli Blackman, with audio design by Stronach. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another true crime conversation.